In February of 1914, a mother in Grangeville, Idaho knelt in front of her daughter and pinned postage stamps to the little girl's coat. She was not decorating her. She was addressing her. The child was 5 years old, just short of her 6th birthday. Her name was May, and that morning, in the eyes of the United States Post Office, she became a parcel. Hold on that image. A child. A paper tag. A train pulling out of a mountain town. Because 2 questions sit inside it, and neither one has the answer you would expect. The first, who on earth allowed this, and was it actually legal, or did the law simply never think to say no? The second, and this is the one that should unsettle you. May was not the only package like her that year. She was not even the strangest thing riding in those mail cars. We will come back to May. Keep her in your mind, stamps and all. Here is what the record shows. On the first day of 1913, the United States launched something called Parcel Post. Before that, the mail was, for the most part, letters and papers. Nothing heavy, nothing bulky. Then, almost overnight, the post office began accepting packages, and the country responded in the quiet, practical way that countries do. In the first week alone, close to 2 million packages moved through the system. Farmers mailed produce. Merchants mailed hardware. For families in remote places, the mailman had suddenly become the most useful person they had ever met. But here is the detail almost everyone skips. When Parcel Post opened, very little had been written about what could not be sent. The rules were nearly a blank page. And a blank page, handed to a curious nation, is an invitation. So people tested it. They mailed eggs. They mailed bricks. They mailed live snakes. A mortuary in St. Louis mailed human ashes across a state line for burial. In one town, a package of skunk hides was so overpowering that the local post office had to be evacuated. And in January of 1913, a woman in Elgin, Illinois wrote to the postal authorities with a simple, astonishing question. What would it cost to mail herself to Washington? That is the world May was born into. Not a world of strict rules bent by criminals, a world with barely any rules at all, being filled out in real time by ordinary people. And in that world, the idea of mailing a child was not the act of a monster. It was, to the people who did it, simply practical. Return to Idaho. The record here is unusually precise because May's case was written down in detail. She was sent about 73 miles from her parents in Grangeville to her grandparents in Lewiston. The postage was 53 cents in stamps, pinned to her coat. And the reason it came to that exact figure is the part that should stop you. May weighed just under 49 pounds, a hair below the 50-pound weight limit for a parcel. The post office did not price her as a little girl. It priced her as a package that happened to weigh 49 pounds. And before you picture something cruel, a child shoved into a canvas sack among the letters, stop. That is not what happened, and the distinction is the whole point of this story. May rode in the train's mail compartment, and the clerk who carried her, a man named Leonard Mochel, was not a stranger. By the family's account, he was her mother's cousin. When the train reached Lewiston, a conductor named Harry Morris is said to have found the small girl sitting quietly among the mail sacks, thought it was the most remarkable thing he had ever seen, and made sure the newspapers heard the tale. That is part of why we know her name at all. Her strange little journey ran in papers from Seattle to New York. That is the part that changes everything. This did not work because the system was careless with children. It worked because in rural America, the person carrying the mail was not an anonymous employee. He was a known man, a trusted man, someone spoken of in that era with something close to reverence. Handing him your child was, in the logic of the time, no stranger than handing her to a neighbor. There is a stubborn little myth attached to May that is worth clearing away, because a story like this lives or dies on getting the details right. You may have heard that she was slipped through as a baby chick on some poultry rate. Postal historians are skeptical of that. Chicks could not even legally be mailed until years later. The truth needs no embroidery. A real girl, real stamps, a real clerk. That is strange enough. Now, If May were the only case, this would be a curiosity. A single odd afternoon in Idaho. But she was not. And this is where the surface cracks. The record, assembled by a curator at the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, documents around 7 children mailed between 1913 and 1915. 7. The very first appears to have been an unnamed infant boy near Cincinnati, Ohio, in the middle of January 1913, mailed, in other words, within days of Parcel Post opening its doors. He weighed just under 11 pounds. His parents paid 15 cents in stamps and, in a detail that is either touching or absurd, insured him for $50. A rural carrier walked the boy a little over a mile to his grandmother's house. 2 weeks later, in Pennsylvania, another couple handed their small daughter to a rural carrier, who delivered her safely that same afternoon to relatives across the county. Her passage cost 45 cents. Sit with that number for a moment. 7. Because it tells you this was not one eccentric family. It was a pattern, quiet, repeating, spread across states, appearing again and again inside the same narrow window of time. Not an accident. A behavior. And the behavior escalated. A single mile is one thing. But in 1915, a 6-year-old named Edna Neff was mailed roughly 720 miles, from Pensacola, Florida, all the way to her father's home in Virginia. She weighed just under the 50-pound limit. Her postage, for that entire journey across the American South, was about 15 cents. Read that again. A child crossed a vast stretch of the country, and it cost less than a loaf of bread because the post office was charging by the pound and by the zone, not by the fact that the pound in question was a living, breathing little girl. Something was clearly wrong with the arithmetic, and the people running the system were beginning to notice. The last documented case tells you they had finally run out of patience. In September of 1915, a 3-year-old named Maud Smith was mailed to her mother in Kentucky. This time, it did not pass quietly. A superintendent of the railway mail service opened an investigation, demanding to know how a child had been accepted onto a train as mail in plain violation of the rules. And after Maud, nothing. She appears to be the final case. The door closed. But here is what should stop you. Ask a simple question. If it was against the rules by 1915, then what rules exactly were being broken at the very start? Why had 7 children already gone through? And the honest answer, the one the mainstream historians insist on, is uncomfortable. Mailing a child was never, at any point, made properly legal. There was no statute that said, yes, you may post your children. What there was instead was silence. The 1913 law did not forbid it, because the people who wrote that law never imagined a human being would need to be named as something you cannot send. It was a loophole not of permission, but of omission. The door was not opened. It was simply never locked, because no one had thought to build the lock. This distinction matters because the louder version of this story, it was legal to mail children, has been fact-checked and rated mostly false. The truth is quieter and somehow stranger. For a narrow window, the law said nothing, and into that silence, ordinary parents walked their children. To feel how wide that silence was, look at what the early rules did bother to name. The post office had written out, in careful detail, the things you could not mail: poisons, explosives, intoxicants, pistols, and revolvers, and, this is real, anything giving off a bad odor. The system had a specific rule against mailing a smelly package. It had opinions about which insects were allowed to travel, and nowhere in all of it was there a single line about a child. That imbalance, a system meticulous about the trivial and silent about the enormous, is the real subject of this story. The children are its human face, but the pattern runs deeper, and it is about to run all the way to its breaking point. Because a system vague enough to let a child ride the mail was vague enough to let something far larger through. And in 1916, a man in Utah looked at those same loose rules, the ones about weight and zones and price by distance, and finished the arithmetic that no one at the post office had bothered to finish. His problem was ordinary. He was helping build a bank in the remote town of Vernal, and he wanted a facade of pressed brick. The nearest source of that brick sat well over 100 miles away, across brutal terrain, and hauling it by ordinary freight would cost several times the price of the brick itself. It should have ended there. Instead, he opened the postal rate book, and what he found was this: Parcel Post charged by weight and by zone, and through a quirk of how those rates worked, mailing the bricks came out dramatically cheaper than freighting them. So he did not freight them. He mailed them. Nearly 37 tons of brick, each one wrapped in paper, packed 10 to a crate to slip under the 50-pound limit, sent not by the short direct road, but along a long, looping postal route of nearly 400 miles, because that was how the rate was calculated. Sit with that image. Not a child in a mail car now. A building, arriving one crate at a time, brick by brick, through the very same system that had carried May. The postal workers of that town were buried, hauling ton after ton of masonry, day after day, because one man had read the rules more carefully than the people who had written them. And this, a bank delivered by mail, is finally what the system could not survive. Because in November of 1916, the post office did the thing it had failed to do for children until it was almost too late. It moved fast. A senior postal official issued a notice declaring that any single sender who offered more than 200 pounds to one address in a single day would now be treated as an unusual shipment, to be stopped and questioned before it could be accepted. In plain terms, you could no longer mail a building. The loophole that had carried a 5-year-old across Idaho and a 6-year-old across the South had finally scaled up to 37 tons of brick, and only then, only at that size, did the machine finally write the rule. And that is the pattern laid bare. Look at the sequence. Children were mailed, and only afterward did a bar on mailing humans appear. A bank was mailed, and only afterward did a limit on massive shipments appear. Every line in the long, familiar list of things you cannot send through the mail was not handed down from above by careful planners. It was written backward, reactively, one strange package at a time, by a government forever a single step behind its own citizens. The public did not follow the rules of Parcel Post. In a very real sense, the public wrote them, by walking to the edge of what the system allowed and stepping over it, again and again, until someone in an office was forced to draw a line exactly where they had just been standing. And it was not only bricks and produce that pushed those edges. Somewhere in the same stretch of years, a man wrote to the Postmaster General in plain language, asking how he ought to wrap and address a baby he intended to obtain, so that the child could be shipped to him through the mail. That letter, more than any single mailed toddler, seems to have been the thing that made the ceiling finally drop. May's journey in early 1914, together with an inquiry like that one arriving the same month, was what at last moved Postmaster General Albert Burleson to direct every postmaster in the country that human beings, all of them, were barred from the mail. And the rule held about as well as you would expect. Barely a month after that order went out, a rural carrier in Maryland quietly carried a 14-pound baby a dozen miles from its grandmother's home to its mother's. Old habits and old trust do not vanish because a memo says they must. Not a conspiracy, then. Not a cover-up. Something quieter and more human. A country that trusted its mail so completely that it handed over the things it valued most. Its goods, its buildings, and for one narrow window, its children, and a system that only learned its own limits by watching that trust go too far. Which brings us back to a cold morning in Grangeville, and a little girl with stamps pinned to her coat. We know she arrived. We know she was carried by a man who was family, who delivered her safely to her grandmother's door. We know that within a few short years, no mother in America could ever do again what May's mother did that morning, because the blank space in the rulebook where a child's name should have been was finally filled in. But we do not really know what she understood, standing on that platform, whether she thought it was an adventure, whether she looked back, whether her mother, watching the train pull away into the mountains, felt the ordinary calm of sending a package, or the first faint unease of a country that had not yet decided where its trust should end. The stamps are documented. The journey is documented. What remains difficult to explain is the moment itself. A nation so certain of the person carrying its mail that, for one narrow, unrepeatable window, it was willing to address a child and let it go.